Welcome to the second part of our discussion of urbanization, immigration, and social reactions. Today we're going to be looking at the conditions of American cities in the late 19th and early 20th century. We'll be talking about some of the new types of people that were flocking to these cities from around the world, and we'll be looking at the reactions to not only their experience, but their role in American society at the time. To do this, we're going to ask the following questions. How did immigration affect the growth of cities? What changing demographic patterns of immigration occurred? How did immigrants respond to life in the American city? What was life like in the shadows of the American skyscraper? And how did Americans respond to changing demographics and the rise of urban America? In our last discussion, we talked about the urbanization of America and the physical growth of cities, and we mentioned or we looked at a lot of the population growth. And what we noticed is that American cities were growing exponentially during the time of industrialization. Today, we want to look at some of the factors that contribute to the actual growth of a city, how cities grow, and why cities grew during this time. So, our first kind of question we should ask is, how do cities just grow in general? There's kind of three basic ways that a city grows. This could be for Greenville or Raleigh or any area. Is that cities can grow physically, as in they can just extend their borders. So I live right outside the city limits of Greenville, and there is a future one day where they might extend the borders of the cities, and then I would be counted in the city population. I would pay into the city tax base. I would also be able to participate in elections in the city. So you get those benefits, but that's a kind of a drawing of the map way of a city's growth. It's not like there's a real dramatic change in the population in that method of growth. There's a natural increase. Cities can just grow naturally. And the way that this would happen is that there would just, over time, there would need to be more births than deaths. And this natural rate of growth could contribute to a population increase in an area or nationally. There's a third way, and that is where people who didn't live in that city migrate to that area. So if the net migration of people into a city is higher than people leaving that city, a city could grow. Now, if we were going to look at the American city in the late 19th century, could really generalize that these cities grew by 1 and 3. It did not appear that they grew because of a natural or excessive increase in births, and a lot of that could be contributed to the difficult living conditions at the time in the American city. So if we're trying to figure out kind of some of the patterns that are going on in America in, say, 1890 or 1910, we know that cities are growing. They're growing significantly. The evidence suggests that these cities were growing by either an extension of borders or, most importantly to our discussion, a migration of immigrants to the area. So what were some of the factors that contributed to this sudden burst of immigration where Americans saw this is the time period that America becomes the melting pot, right? Is that this is when a real sense of diversity was injected into American cities and American culture. There are a lot of push and pull factors that contributed to immigration. There's two ways to think of why someone would leave one place and go to another. There are the forces that push them out of the place that they lived. So if they're coming from Italy or Poland or Eastern Europe, there are forces in that area that could be pushing these individuals out of that, looking for some sort of opportunity. It could be economic problems, it could be religious problems, it could be health conditions. And so one of the effects that was pushing people to America was the effects of industrialization. It was these changes that we've been discussing occurred throughout the world. They were not just limited to the United States. even though that is where it seemed the biggest wave of some of these industrial changes was occurring at the time. But as it became harder for a farmer in northern Italy to compete, or some sort of textile manufacturer in Belgium to compete with the industrial world, they all feel the effects of this. So maybe the effects of industrialization place pressures, economic pressures, on immigrants where they lived that push them to seek other opportunities. You can see other examples. In the 1880s, Italy experienced a cholera epidemic, and that resonates with us today as we are going through this COVID-19 scare, is that it could push people to flee an area looking for a place they feel safer, and also they feel they have more opportunity. There are other examples where there could be religious components, and this occurred in the 1880s and 1890s in Russia, where certain people, particularly Jewish people, were persecuted because of their religious faith at the time. So these people fled looking for some sort of sanctuary and ability to maintain their culture, and America was a big draw at the time. But while there are push factors pushing people out, whether they're biological, economic, religious, and cultural, there are also a lot of factors that were drawing them to the United States during the time. And that was that economic opportunity that we have focused on so much. America was experiencing a period of unprecedented economic growth at the time, and that was attractive to people. There are stories or accounts of immigrants coming where they have heard rumors that America's streets are paved with gold. And while they found out quickly they were not literally paved with gold, we saw the idea of American opportunity, that kind of encapsulated by someone like an Andrew Carnegie, becomes a real draw to people seeking opportunity, work, and mobility in American society. So just to continue to explore some of these factors that were going in, one example of, I said that a city could grow by just extension of the borders, is New York City grew at one point by incorporating the Bronx, Staten Island, and Brooklyn into the city. So they changed the map, and all of a sudden the tax base goes from 2 million to 5 million people in a stroke of a pen. But again, really, we're continuing our real focus for why immigration was such a boom in between about 1880 and 1920 should be focused on number 3, by that migration, as more people were coming to America than were leaving. And even if there was not a natural growth in births, those migration numbers truly were impressive. So what I'd like for you to do is open up your presentation, and it's available on Moodle. And I'd like for you to watch this short video from History.com about the immigrant experience and some of the factors that were drawing them to the United States. All right, now that you've watched that video, I'm going to continue on and talk about a place that is famous for the story of immigration, and that is Ellis Island. Ellis Island was built in 1892 and was a replacement for an institution known as the Castle Garden Receiving Center that was run by the state of New Jersey. And Ellis Island is an interesting venue or place in American history. One, because so many people have passed through it. More than 12 million people have immigrated to America through Ellis Island. And so this is where an individual who was coming from a foreign nation seeking an opportunity in America would come and be processed, and their process potentially of their stay in the United States or one day citizenship would begin. Now, Ellis Island is interesting in one hand because it was built because the previous place of entry, Castle Garden Receiving Center, was not capable of handling the flood of migrants coming to America. So these immigrants, there's so many coming during the period. What it tells us is this is a federal issue, not a state issue. As immigration was maybe a state could have helped and handled this in an era where there was a trickle. But as the floodgates are opened for immigrants in the industrial era, this clearly becomes something that has to be run and facilitated by the federal government. Now, I'd like for you to take this opportunity to watch a short clip on the experience of Ellis Island. If you open your presentation on Moodle, you can access that by clicking on that blue hyperlink right there. All right, now that you've watched that short video on the experience of immigrants through Ellis Island, I want to talk about some of the challenges for immigrants, and that would be acclimation to American life. And one of the things that you have to consider is what was life like for an immigrant who showed up in, say, 1904 or 1889. Rarely did they come with a lot of financial means. Maybe they came by themselves. Maybe they were following in the footsteps of some former family members. But they likely had not had any experience with American society. There's a good chance they do not speak the language. Right? And they have a lack of resources to kind of get started. So you're all of a sudden thrust into a new country, a new culture, and you're there potentially for economic opportunity, but the means of capitalizing on that opportunity are difficult. So one of the things that characterizes immigrants during this experience was this transitional moment of trying to acclimate to living in America. And if you look at the historical evidence, one of the things that we really see is a strong retention of an ethnic identity and heritage of where these immigrants came from. They did not just leave wherever they had come from, left Italy or Poland, and when they arrived in America, shed those identities and all of a sudden said, I'm American ho-hum. Instead, a lot of these immigrants held on to things that helped support their ethnic identities. So if we look at what one historian said, he said, throughout the 20th century, social life in the community flowed along paths shaped by a strong ethnic identification among the various nationalities. And so some evidence here that these individuals were drawn potentially for economic opportunity, but not necessarily with the desire of shedding their ethnic identity, can be seen in a survey in 1905 in Chicago, where 284 households revealed that there were only 5 interethnic couples. So that's evidence that suggests that Italians were marrying Italians, that Polish people were marrying Polish people. And so another thing is that holding on to this ethnic identity turned out to be a means of support, a support system, and comfort. So one example of this is that Hungarians are often, they were called bohunks. It was kind of it was a negative term for Hungarians, but from Bohemia. And this is the terminology used before the nation of Hungary was formed. But they formed their own banks. They formed their own essentially life insurance or death insurance programs. That's what these benefit societies would be. If someone falls sick, if someone loses a job, it's like an insurance plan. They formed 5 bicycle clubs, 4 drama groups. But you see, it was their ethnic ties. They were living together. They were retaining that culture and not necessarily throwing it to the wayside. And so what you saw During the industrial era in the American city, as this flood of immigrants come, what they call ethnic enclaves, and that is neighborhoods that were characterized by ethnic groups. So think of Little Italy or Chinatown. You can go to Boston and go to Chinatown. You can go to New York City and go to Chinatown. And this would be where those immigrants who are trying to acclimate to the American experience, this shows that their ethnic ties, and it was that ethnic support system that really helped them in the adversity of living in this time. So now that we've talked about some of the process of immigration and the difficulties acclimating culturally, uh, learning the language, finding economic opportunity, I want to talk about a little bit about some patterns of immigration that occurred during this time. And one of the things that characterizes American immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is that the immigrant was coming from a different region of the world than traditionally before. From the 18th century and the 1700s, immigrants were typically related to in the British world in some way, or of African descent. On top of that, as you continue to grow as a nation and people come over, throughout the early 1800s, attracted people of French, German, Irish background, but a lot of times these immigrants had a easy time or an easier time acclimating to American society. One of the reasons being is that maybe they share some cultural backgrounds about ideas of government, or they share linguistic backgrounds, or they share religious backgrounds. For instance, most of those early immigrants were Protestant. So there's some way that it seemed that they found a way to fit into what the norms for American society were at the time. But as we get into the industrial age, we see what they call the new immigrant appear on the scene. And the new immigrant is an individual or a group of individuals that do not come from that sort of Western European cultural descent. Instead, these new immigrants often came from Eastern Europe or the Mediterranean region, Italy, right? Look in Greece, farther north, Lithuania, right? Romania, Hungary. And while they may be Christian, they were Catholic a lot of time. Or if you are Jewish, you've always had this sort of antagonist relationship with Christianity and American history. Or part of this new immigrant also was people from Asia who lacked, or didn't lack, but had a different cultural background when it came to not language formation, ideas about government and society. So this new immigrant often did not fit into that easy model of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Instead, there was a more difficult time assimilating, if that was, and we saw that wasn't the goal, right? Earlier, we talked about how that a lot of these immigrants were not really particularly interested in shedding their culture for this wholesale adoption of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. And so for James Barrett in Work and Community in the Jungle, he wrote, one of the greatest testaments to ethnic cohesion in Packingtown, that's a section, a neighborhood in Chicago, is the slow progress that formal Americanization, English instruction, and naturalization made in the community. And what he looked at in this work is that immigrants often were not trying to seek full citizenship status. So the Immigration Commission of 1909 found that only 27.7 Poles, 21% of Lithuanians, and 11.7% of Slovaks had completed naturalization or becoming citizenship. But 2 out of 5 Poles, One out of four Lithuanians and one out of two Slovaks returned back home. This is where the term the globetrotter comes from. So if you see this, is that what does this historical evidence tell us? It tells us that a lot of immigrants are coming to the United States during this period. They are bringing with them strong ethnic identities of their own culture and history with them. And that often that we see that these don't just easily translate into the norms of American society. So this new immigrant who also was actively working to protect their ethnic identity was having trouble assimilating, if that was even the desire. And so now what I want to focus on right now is American nativism and the reactions to this new immigrant. And a new immigrant that at first may not show the pandering desire to become, to fit in to American culture, or may not demonstrate just a quickness or exuberance for assimilation into American society. So, how were these new immigrants in these enclaves in this different culture, these different cultures welcomed? You know, what we see rise in America side by side of this increased immigration and the changing demographics of the American city. As urbanization is going on, a lot of these issues, whether it be immigration, urbanization, politics, they all conflated together. And there were some people, as they looked throughout society and they saw the changes and challenges that came with urbanization, that they saw that the immigrant itself as a potential weakening, or one of the factors that was really changing, the negative factors in the changes going on in American society. So if you look at this political cartoon right here, is that this is American government, right? Uncle Sam representing American society. And you have these ideas of open access, United States of America, land of the free, welcome, walk in. But he's holding his nose because what you see is some of the things that were starting to be characterized with these immigrants. This is a poor individual. Look, his only bags are poverty and disease. So they're not strengthening the American economy in their eyes. Instead, they're draining it of its vitality. Disease, interesting, because think about today and what's going on with COVID-19. Some people suggest that as this is labeled a disease, people emphasize that this started in China, kind of resembles a nativist thread. But if you also look too, is that these immigrants are also bringing with them ideas that are contrary, antithetical to American Protestant society. You see the barrel on his back that says Sabbath. Well, that indicates that this individual is not committed to not working, taking Sundays off. So that could be someone who is Jewish. They celebrate on Saturdays. Anarchy is another one, as these political ideas are budding that we've talked about as socialism, communism, anarchism, that these ideas are being associated with people coming from outside of America, bringing them here and weakening the fabric of the country. So this attitude that these cultural differences, the formation of melting pot, this mass advancement of poor immigrants or this mass advancement of new immigrants, this idea that it was weakening American society is known as nativism. Here's Henry Cabot Lodge addressing how to deal with this. He says the question, and he's in the Senate. He's on a Senate committee that's in charge of immigration. And he says the question before the committee was how this could best be done. That is, what is the method that the largest number of undesirable immigrants and the smallest possible number of desirable immigrants could be shut out? So he's saying, what is a system that we could do that attracts strong immigrants that add to American culture and keeps out those who weaken it. He said, it is found, and look at this, the idea is what is considered weakening American society? Is it cultural diversity? Is it different ideas on economics and politics? Here, I think you can read between the lines a little bit in this statement. It is found in the first place that the literacy test will bear most heavily upon Italians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Greeks, Asiatics, and very lightly or not at all upon English speaking immigrants. So he's saying if we put in this literacy test, it's going to naturally prevent or funnel people out who are from Italy, Russian, Poland, Hungarians, Greeks, this new immigrant. So you can certainly see that nativist thread of like encouraging the old immigrant and discouraging the new immigrant alive in the American conversation. So what I want you to think about is how did nativism arise as the demographics of Americans change? So let's go back to our focus question. And what we know is this is that we are trying to talk, we've talked about how immigrants respond. We've talked about the changing demographic patterns. So think new immigrants, think enclaves, right? Difficulty assimilating, an importance, an emphasis now on retaining culture. And right now we are going to skip down. How did Americans respond to changing demographics and the rise of urban America? What I want you to think about here is the emergence of nativism. So how did we see nativism arise? Those attitudes that we're talking about right now when we were talking about these statements from Henry Cabot Lodge. What ways do we see those manifested in society? One area that we see the infiltration of this nativist thread in American society is just simply in language. And to avoid getting too much in the weeds of racial and ethnic slurs, just examples of slurs being a reflection upon how society interacts with you. So my family comes from Italian heritage, and the two of the most infamous slurs that go along with Italians are Dago and WAP. And so Dago being a derivative of Diego, kind of referencing that Spanish, Portuguese, Italian descent, or WAP being associated with anyone who has like kind of that swagger and charisma maybe that's associated with Italians. I don't know how to explain that, but it comes from the term guapo. But if you use these, whether it be someone to reference their Jewish ethnicity, their Italian background, those types of slurs are examples of how people in society, if they are willing and accepting of these new cultures, or also if they are resistant to them. Another way to see, or another example of this nativist thread arising in the United States in the late 19th century comes from examples of anti-Catholicism. And America throughout its founding phases, throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, was mainly inhabited by Protestants. And Protestants and Catholics, both Christian, are divergent in their outlook of Christianity. So one thing that comes about during this period, or should we say, and I'm sorry as I had the wrong screen up, one thing that emerges is that you see the emergence of the American Protective Association. And that in the 1890s, you see this group, or in 1887, it's founded in Iowa. And what the fears are is that these immigrants that are coming to America are spreading Catholicism, which is contrary to the traditional American culture. So you can see nativism, we've looked at two examples in language and dialect. We've also seen formal organizations like the American Protective Association. But another example of this rising nativist sentiment and this reflection of what society is seeing about these changes can be seen in legislation itself. Think back to what Henry Cabot Lodge was saying with literacy tests on immigrants. We can manipulate and control immigration. And if you look at this political cartoon right here, the evils of unrestricted immigration, this idea, and it's actually very relevant to today's society. The idea is, are open borders okay? Is give me you're sick, you're tired, and you're poor, or give me you're successful, educated, and hardworking. We've looked at language, we've looked at social groups and organizations, and now we're going to look at specific legislation. Is the only way to handle this, according to this political cartoon, is to put limitations and restrictions, quotas, on how immigration is going to occur. You'll see this reach its peak in the 1920s after World War I, and we kind of retreat an isolationist attitude. But the best example for legislation restrictions during this period can be seen on the West Coast in reaction to the flood of Chinese immigrants who, at one point, were encouraged to come here because of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, but over time were seen as economic threats and also an unwillingness to assimilate, and many people's ideas, an inability to assimilate. This leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So what do we want to do when we're talking about in our essays how Americans are reacting to these changes of the new immigrant? We want to talk about changes in attitudes about their culture. You can reference how they viewed their backgrounds of being, or maybe it's on religious grounds, maybe it's on ethnic grounds, maybe it's just on cultural grounds. You would reference language and the emergence of ethnic slurs, or not the emergence, but that as an example of the nativist thread. The American Protection Association as a social organization working to protect traditional America, and the Chinese Exclusion Act as an example of legislation that was used to change to handle these changes. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to urbanization in the American city is what was life like in the shadows of the skyscraper. And what I want you to understand is that during this rapid growth, a lot of pressures were placed on society from different angles. What are some characteristics of the American city in the shadows of the skyscraper? Well, these cities were often very crowded. They were transitioning from a agrarian traditional lifestyle to an industrial lifestyle. So there's still a mixture of people trying to, there was something like 800,000 tons taken out of horse manure in Chicago in the 1880s, taken out monthly or something. So this put a lot of pressures. Not only are these very crowded cities, right? They're budding, yes, they're big budding cities, but they are also overcrowded at times. There's problems with sanitation. Think about where is being hit with disease the most in America right now with the COVID scare, with the COVID pandemic is happening in these places with high concentrated populations. So you have overcrowded cities that are often unsanitary, that lead to tremendous health threats. So you'll have potential cholera epidemics, smallpox epidemics, polio epidemics. These are always threats in places where people live in very congested areas with not the best sanitation, dirty drinking water, problems with sewage. So one example of the crowding of the American city was that the invention of the dumbbells tenement apartment, and this was actually a a 30, I think it was 30 by or 25 by 50 or something. They found a way to put 80 homes in this very small, like quarter acre property. So what this does is you could have somewhat upwards of 80 families living in a very concentrated area. And who were these families? Often these people were struggling economically, having difficulties adjusting to American life or the challenges of industrialization. So the city was not the most welcoming place at times for a lot of people. If you see here in a tenement slum right here, entire families living in a single room apartment. So what we have is this leads to often crime. It leads to homelessness, children who are orphaned. So there will be a lot of social issues facing these cities. And one of the also challenges you see in American history when it comes to the emergence of the city and urbanization is the corruption that started to pervade these cities. Is that there's a lot of tax money here, there's a lot of business and economic opportunity, and does the political system work for the public good, or are there weaknesses within that system overlaid with the industrial world? So you also see in the emergence of the early American city these strong political machines who would be orchestrated by political bosses, the most famous being the Tammany Hall ring, run by Boss William Tweed. He's a big, giant figure, both in reality and in his character. He swindled the New York City tax base for millions and millions of dollars. He used corrupt practices to stuff the ballot box, to put his friends in political places. Graft, which is a kickback, so he would be giving his friends contracts to build something and be on the take, overcharging the city for that. They would kick it back to him. So what you have is the city was growing so fast that there were so many pressures put on it from just a infrastructural outlook to the overcrowding. How do you deal with all the sewage and the sanitation of this, to how does a society that is growing so fast, how does it exhibit stability? And then on top of that these are also great opportunities for certain people to capitalize upon. So as we continue to move forward, I want you to think about this, is that there's a lot of economic growth, there's a lot of physical growth, but there's also a lot of social strain. And this is creating an environment that leads us to our next discussion with progressivism. And that is, how does American society ultimately respond to all of these changes? And how do they continue to work forward through issues of poverty, crime, sanitation, political corruption, mass immigration, with people not always assimilating into American society with ease, and issues about business abuse that we talked about in our last discussion. So kind of keep this in mind, that this is a springboard to our next discussion. The last thing I think is kind of very cool to think about the American city is that it is during this period where leisure activity and kind of recreation become part of everybody's life. Is that for so long it felt like society was separated between two classes: those who had so much that they could do whatever, but the vast majority of people just living to survive. The industrial world started to create this separation between your work life in your home life. And as you go to work and then you come home, people sought ways to disconnect from these changes in their economic life or these struggles that are placed on them, and just the stress that comes with the industrial world. And one, think about it, as Americans are some of the most stressed out people because of how much our work means to us. So this is when we get leisure sports like baseball coming about, professional sports where people follow these purely for recreational game. Another thing that you see is the emergence of Nickelodeons, and that is new technology leads to motion pictures where you can go in for a nickel and it might be a 15-minute film, but it's a way to disconnect from the stresses of the industrial world. So, also a cool way to think about is that for a long time, the concept of Netflix was just foreign to the world, or most people of the world, and the industrial world brought it, almost democratized recreation. Thanks for tuning in to this lecture. I know that it can be difficult trying to self motivate. I want to encourage you all to read your textbook, to stay engaged in the class. Make sure you're taking notes throughout these lectures. Please, please watch them and communicate any questions to me that you might have going forward. I'll be in touch.